Hello viewers, today we are going to study about Thomas Hobbes' Treatise on Human Nature. We are going to look at the views that he had about human nature, the factors which determine the good and the evil, and his views about human nature and the government. Thomas Hobbes was born in Malmsbury, England. As he noted in his autobiography, he was born a twin of fear because his mother went into premature labor out of fear that the Spanish Armada was about to attack England. Although the theme of fear and its overwhelming power would recur in his later work, Thomas Hobbes' early years were largely free of anxiety. He was educated in England's finest school under the tutelage and patronage of some of its prominent noblemen and intellectuals. English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes is widely held as the father of political science. His book in the year 1651, Leviathan, makes the case of why monarchy is the only political system that is consistent with human nature. He bases his argument on the following assumptions about humans in the state of nature, what we would now call indigenous peoples. Hobbes assumes that without strong centralized authority, human beings will perpetually be at war with each other, where every man is enemy to every man. Furthermore, he assumes that there would be no art, no leisure, no ability to travel over water to create community building projects. Of course, Hobbes had never ever traveled more than 100 miles from the island of his birth, so his understanding of how indigenous people behaved was informed by second-hand accounts and his own imagination. Hobbes lived through a tumultuous period in English history, and his most productive years as a philosopher coincided with the time of political turmoil and civil war. Early in the year 1640s, when it became clear that the Parliament was going to turn on King Charles I, Hobbes fled to France. As a devoted monarch, Hobbes feared persecution if he stayed in an England run by parliamentarians. He stayed in France for about 11 years, during which he produced much of his most important writings. Hobbes' most famous work, Leviathan, was published in the year 1651, 2 years after Charles I had been executed by the administrators of the Long Parliament, the leaders of the first non-monarchical government in English history. Although Leviathan won him a new notary at the time of its publication, Hobbes' political philosophy was already well known in parliamentary circles, where he was generally vilified. Hobbes was supremely an individual thinker. He attempted through his writings to influence the political conflicts of his days, but he managed to alienate himself even from those who might have been inclined to side with him. During the Civil War, he chose not to tone down his rhetorical favoring absolutist monarchy, as did many other royalists. At a moment when everyone on the king's side was at pain to proclaim their support for the Church of England, he trumpeted his distaste for the clergy. These indiscretions caused Hobbes to be banned from the court of King Charles, where he was perhaps the most prominent royalist intellectual of the day. He also differentiated himself from the royalist cohort by claiming the king's rule came not from a divine right granted by God, but from a social contract granted by the people. This iconographical position has led many to consider Hobbes to be among the first liberal political thinkers in Europe, despite the disdain of his ideas held by liberal philosophers due to Hobbes' authoritarian views. Hobbes' political philosophy was rooted in his fundamental conviction that all philosophy needed to be overhauled. Hobbes believed that traditional philosophy had never been able to reach irrefutable conclusions or secure universal truth, and that this failure was the cause not only of philosophical controversies but also of civil discord and even civil war. Hobbes set out to create a philosophical system that provided a secure and agreed upon basis for all knowledge in the universe. This totalizing philosophy, which Hobbes developed over many years, was based in the materialistic outlook that all phenomena in the universe are traceable to the physical properties of matter and motion. Hobbes, however, rejected as legitimate basis for philosophical knowledge. In this respect, he diverged from his near contemporary Francis Bacon, who also proposed a total reform of philosophy, but one based on the experimental method. Instead, Hobbes proposed a purely deductive philosophy that bases its finding on previously stated, universally agreed upon first principles. Hobbes sought to create a philosophy capable of explaining absolutely everything that happens in the universe, and he produced original work that cut across virtually every academic discipline. He engaged in lengthy intellectual feuds with figures as wide-ranging as the mathematician, such as John Wallis, the philosopher, René Descartes, and the scientist Robert Boyle. Hobbes argues that the state of nature is a miserable state of war in which none of our important human ends are realized or reliably realized. Happily, human nature also provides resources to escape these miserable conditions. Hobbes argues that each of us as a rational being can see that a war of all against all is inimical to the satisfaction of her interest, and so can agree that peace is good, and therefore also the ways or means of peace are good. Humans will recognize as imperatives the injunctions to seek peace and to do those things necessary to secure it when they can do so safely. Hobbes calls these practical imperatives laws of nature, the sum of which is not to treat others in the ways we would not have them treat us. These precepts, conclusions, or theorems of reasons are eternal and immutable, always commanding our assent even when they may not safely be acted upon. They forbid many familiar vices such as iniquity, cruelty, and ingratitude. Although commentators do not agree on whether these laws should be regarded as mere precepts of prudence or rather as divine commands or moral imperatives of some other sort, all agree that Hobbes understands them to direct people to submit to political authority. They tell us to seek peace with willing others by laying down part of us right to all things, by mutually convenatingly to submit to the authority of a sovereign, and further directs us to keep the covenant, establishing sovereignty. Hobbes believed that human beings naturally desire the power to live well, and they will never be satisfied with the power they have without acquiring more power. After this, he believes there usually succeed a new desire such as fame and glory, easy and sensual pleasure or admiration from others. He also believes that all people are created equally, that everyone is equal, capable of killing each other, because although one man may be stronger than another, the weaker may be compensated for by which his intellect or some other individual aspects. Hobbes believed that the nature of humanity leads people to seek power. He said that when two or more people want the same thing, they become enemies and attempt to destroy each other. He called this time when men oppose each other, that is, war. He said that there were three basic causes for war: competition, distrust, and glory. In each of these cases, men use violence to invade their enemies' territories, either for their personal gain or their safety or for their glory. He said that without a common power to unite the people, there would be in a war of every man against every man as long as the will to fight is known. He believed that this state of war was the nature state of human beings, and that harmony among human beings is artificial because it is based on an agreement. If a group of people had something in common, such as a common interest or a common goal, they would not be at war and united. They would be more powerful against those who would seek to destroy them. One thing he noted was consistent in all men was their interest in self-preservation. Hobbes' views of human nature led him to develop his vision of an ideal government. He believed that a common power was required to keep men united. This power would work to maintain the artificial harmony among the people as well as to protect them from foreign enemies. This power would either be one man or an assembly appointed by the people. The people who would make an agreement among themselves to all and to submit to this ruler. The people would submit their wills to the wills of their ruler, who would in turn assure their self-preservation. Thus, the ruler would have absolute control over his domain. Hobbes refers to this kind of ruler as a sovereign and his people as subjects. Hobbes believed that all phenomena in the universe without exception can be explained in terms of motions and interactions of material bodies. He did not believe in the soul or in the mind as separated from the body, or in any of the other incorporeal and metaphysical entities in which other writers have believed. Instead, he saw human beings as essentially machines, when even their thoughts and emotions operating according to physical laws and chains of cause and effect, action and reaction. As machines, human beings pursue their own self-interest relentlessly, mechanically, avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure. Hobbes saw the commonwealth or society as a similar machine, larger than the human body and artificial, but nevertheless operating according to the laws governing motion and collusion. In putting together these materialistic view of the world, Hobbes was influenced by his contemporary, that is Galileo and Kepler, who had discovered laws governing planetary motion. thereby discrediting much of the Aristotelian worldview. Hobbes hoped to establish similar laws of motion to explain the behavior of human beings, but he was more impressed by Galileo and Kepler's mathematical precision than by their use of empirical data and observation. Hobbes hoped to arrive at this law of motion deductively in the manner of geometrical proofs. It is important to note that Hobbes was not in any position to prove that all of human experience can be explained in terms of physical and mechanical processes. That task would have required scientific knowledge far beyond that possessed by the 17th century. Even today, science is nowhere near being able to fully explain human experience in physical terms, even though most people tend to believe that science will one day be able to do justice. In the absence of such a detailed explanation, the image of human beings as a machine in Hobbes's writing remains more a metaphor than a philosophical proof. Hobbes rejected that we now know as a scientific method because he believed that the observation of nature itself is too subjective, a basis on which to ground philosophy and science. Hobbes contested the scientific system of natural philosophers, that is, Francis Bacon and Robert Boyle. These major figures in the scientific revolution in England based their natural philosophy on a process of inductive reasoning, making inferences and conclusions based on the observation of nature and the manipulation of nature through experimentation. For Hobbes, the chief aim of philosophy is to create a totalizing system of truth that bases all its claims on a set of foundational principles and is universally demonstrable through the logics of language. He rejects the observation of nature as a means of ascertaining truth because individual humans are capable of seeing the world in vastly different ways. He rejects inductive reasoning, arguing that the results of the contrived experiments carried out by a few scientists can never be universally demonstrable outside of the laboratory. Accordingly, Hobbes holds the geometry is the branch of knowledge that best approximates the reasoning that should form the basis of a true philosophy. He calls for a philosophy based on a universally agreed upon first principles that form the foundation for subsequent assertions. Now we will look at the fears as the determining factor in human life. Hobbes maintained that the constant back and forth meditation between the emotions of fear and the emotions of hope is the defining principle of all human actions. Either fear or hope is present at all times in all people. In a famous passage of Leviathan, Hobbes states that the worst aspect of the state of nature is the continual fear and danger of violent death. In the state of nature as Hobbes depicts it, humans intuitively desire to obtain as much power and good as they can, and there are no laws preventing them from harming or killing others to attain what they desire. Thus, the state of nature is a state of constant war, wherein humans live in a perpetual fear of one another. This fear in combination with these faculties of reasons impel men to follow the fundamental laws of nature and seek peace among each other. Peace is attained only by coming together to forge a social contract whereby men consent to being ruled in a commonwealth governed by one supreme authority. Fear creates the chaos endemic to the state of nature, and fear upholds the peaceful order of the civil commonwealth. The contract that creates the commonwealth is forged because of people's fear, and it is enforced by fear, because the sovereign at the commonwealth's head holds the power of the bodily punish anyone who break the contract. The natural fear of such harm compels subjects to uphold the contract and submit to the sovereign will. Hobbes believed that in man's natural state, moral ideas do not exist. Thus, in speaking of human nature, he defines good simply as that which people desire and evil as that which they avoid, at least in the state of nature. Hobbes uses these definitions as basis for explaining a variety of emotions and behaviors. For example, hope is the prospect of attaining some apparent good, whereas fear is the recognition that some apparent good may not be attainable. Hobbes admits, however, that this definition is only tenable as long as we consider men outside the constraint of law and society. In the state of nature, when the only sense of good and evil derives from individuals' appetites and desires, general rules about whether good or evil does not exist. Hobbes believes that moral judgment about good and evil cannot exist until they are decreed by a society's central authority. This position leads directly to Hobbes' belief in an autocratic and absolutist form of government. Absolute monarchy as the best form of government. Hobbes promoted that monarchy is the best form of government and the only one that can guarantee peace. In some of his early works, he only says that there must be a supreme sovereign power of such kind in society, without stating definitely which sort of sovereign power is the best. In Leviathanian, however, Hobbes unequivocally argues that absolute monarchy is the only right form of government. In general, Hobbes seeks to define the rational basis upon which a civil society could be constructed that would be subject to destruction from within. Accordingly, he delineates how best to minimize discord, disagreement and fractionalism within the society, whether between two states and the church, between rival governments, between different contending philosophies, etc. Hobbes believes that any such conflict leads to civil war. He holds that any form of order government is preferably to civil war. Thus, he advocates that all members of society submit to one absolute central authority for the sake of maintaining the common peace. In Hobbes' system, obedience to the sovereign is directly tied to the peace in all realms. The sovereign is empowered to run the government, to determine all laws, to be in charge of the church, to determine first principles and to objurgate in philosophical disputes. For Hobbes, this is the only sure means of maintaining a civil, peaceful polity and preventing the dissolution of society into civil war. Let's look at the few quotations of Thomas Hobbes. For the law of nature, as justice, equity, modesty, mercy, and in some, doing to others as we would be done to. of themselves without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions that carry us at partiality, pride, revenge, and the like. Another doctrine which talks about the civil society is that whatsoever a man does against his conscience is sin, and it dependeth on the presumptions of making himself judge of good and evil. For a man's conscience and his judgments are the same thing, and as the judgment, so also the conscience may be erroneous. Finally, leisure is the mother of philosophy. I hope you have understood the treatise of human nature. Thank you and see you in the next session.